So I'm open.
All right, here we go. I do
Yep.
have some. Have you, in your experience, have you addressed?
Is that on? I'm not hearing you.
Yes.
How do I turn it on?
Yeah, well, I don't know why. Yeah.
Because we have to do something over there.
Are we
Feel
on?
free to sit down if you like. Okay. So go.
Okay. Is that? Am I on?
I think so.
Okay. I guess in your experience, and because one of the frustrations, it doesn't feel like it's on.
You know what? Let's just pass this.
Okay, let's just shut that off.
Yeah, really don't want to deal with some of this technical stuff. Exactly. You were right when you said
Yeah, I think. Is this on now?
it doesn't have an on-off button. Just put your mouth
Okay.
close.
One of the, I think the frustrations we've had, I think I mentioned our group has been, struggling against frac sand mining for 3 years now. And the frustration, the reality that we've come to is that we're in an unzoned community, an unzoned township, the one of 3 that's left in Eau Claire County. There's an Amish population there. The frustration is no matter how much we've tried to educate, and that's been our theme for 3 years, we figured you get things done by educating. So hence our seminars and all the stuff I've talked about that we've done. And we're getting nowhere with it. We're not getting people to turn out. There seems to be, we've got about 3 generations of poverty in our community. There seems to be a sense of despair that nobody can do anything. They're powerless and they want to be left alone. They don't want to get involved in issues. And it's huge, and it's kind of ironic that the people that are the most involved are all of us newer outsiders that are coming in and seeing the problems that are going to happen to this community if we don't do something about it. And it's really frustrating, and I'm just wondering if you've had an experience and how you overcome that. It's that mentality that, they don't want to deal with us, and if they think we have anything to do with zoning, it's like the bristles go up on the back of their neck and they want to go get their guns. They don't want to deal with zoning, and they don't seem to understand that zoning is probably a better alternative than what they're looking at if they don't go to zoning. I'm from the town of Ridge Creek in Eau Claire County. It's between Osseo, Fairchild, and Augusta.
Okay, well, first, I don't know why I have to speak to the entire gymnasium, but okay, this echo. I was involved in a campaign in a town of something like 250,000 people opposing a 2-part referendum that amounted to over $500 million. It was against strip mining of a very poor grade of coal, plus power plants, plus all kinds of loose ends, which our city would not have had control over, but we're going to pay for half of. And because of some other politics that had gone on in the town, the Sierra Club wasn't opposed to it. All the other so-called progressive people were not opposed to it. It's just like they were all hiding their heads in the sand. And so we had a group at that point of like 5 people. And I remember we met in a bar after the referendum was announced, and we just sort of looked at each other and laughed because it was a ridiculous, seemingly hopeless situation, but we knew we couldn't not do something. And in a way, that setup helped us because we knew at the outset that we couldn't count on any of like the usual people we thought would be allies. Sierra Club couldn't commit because of a long, complicated thing with the previous nuclear power plant. And a lot of the kind of power lines in the community had gotten together to sort of head us off at the pass. So for a long time, we didn't go to any regular groups. They didn't want anything to do with us. So we just started where probably we should have started to begin with. And I'm not saying you haven't tried this, but it was like every time we ran into someone, we talked to them. And we'd get somebody calling us up from a neighborhood far away saying, yeah, I heard about that. I'm upset. If you can get me some brochures, I'll walk to 50 of my neighbors. We said, sure. We didn't know who these people were. But it actually took the other side by surprise because they knew we didn't have any money or any institutional support. And before you knew it, people were talking to people, and we told people we'd go anywhere. We didn't usually ask them to come to us, like have an event, because it was hard to set up. We went to churches, to neighborhood meetings, to groups of nurses meetings, any group of any size that had something. We said, you want us to come? And then we always ask, how long do we have? 45 minutes? 10 seconds? We'll take it. And it built little by little. And there was a good ending. Much to my surprise, I made a bet after a long day of the election that we would lose, but it would be close, and we won on 2 separate items, 60-40. Including in almost every precinct in town, including the ones we had just long ago written off. So we had a lot of lucky things on our side, I have to admit that. But we learned a lot just because the official groups in town wouldn't have anything to do with us. We just ended up talking to the people who weren't part of this group or who weren't in the Progressive Caucus or who weren't this. And they talked to each other. So, I mean, it was a real good feeling to think that there were a lot of people out there, if approached one by one. And I still think that's how things get done. So hopefully that's a little encouraging. I can throw some other ideas out, which is that a lot of times you will be welcomed at their group. They don't want to waste the evening coming over and hearing you talking at the public library. But if they're meeting anyway, I mean, it can be a bowling club. You know, if they're already meeting, can I or a friend and I come over and spend 10 minutes of your time? Things like that. So that kind of thing seemed to work. Again, we were very, as I think I implied early, we were very fluid with our kind of literature. Like, we had a generic one, of course, but when something became an issue, we would say, hey, people are getting into this, and we would print up some more of it. I mean, one of our issues was that the quality of the fuel that they wanted to burn was less than the quality of the BTU value of cow manure. And we got that from a government report, and we just spread it all or made these charts, and that really got people's attention, and we got more gigs. Then when that fell out, we had other things like one thing that we didn't originally know we'd have to do, we should have, but we didn't, is that no one really wanted to do the strip mining in the power plant. That's not on everyone's happy list. But we realized that people didn't have a clear sense of what could be alternatives to that. So after learning about all these boring power plants and coal mines and, you know, fake reclamation of land, we had to learn what to suggest instead. And that picked up because people were much more willing to vote against a huge strip mine in a power plant if we could say, these are some options we have, which no one is talking about, and so on. So I've probably talked too long on that issue already. Why don't you follow up if you like, or other people?
As far as generational poverty, that's in our area as well. And I just, from an educator's perspective, there's a really good book written by Ruby Payne. And I cannot think of the title of it, but I know it's written by Ruby Payne. And it talks about generational poverty and how you can, from an educator's viewpoint, speak to that group so that they'll understand better. Ruby Payne, Payne, Ruby Payne. And it's a really easy read. I mean, I read it in one evening. It's super easy read. And it was really, really helpful because I have to speak with people from generational poverty, and I'm a privileged middle-income white chick, so it was good for me to read.
Other people with questions or comments, observations? Okay.
I started writing down as soon as you got up and started talking. I was like, oh yeah, I don't have my 3 seconds. I don't have my 30 seconds.
Yeah, well, actually, now that I think of it, there was one thing I wanted to say, which I thought was kind of lurking in the background today, but which I feel really strongly about. Now, of course, there's an urge at a certain point among a lot of groups to get organized. Okay, what's our structure? Partly so you don't have the wrong people talking at the wrong time and you know you've actually decided something when you've decided, partly for liability reasons. I get that, and that's fine. I also understand that the types of ordinances that they've offered are a neat kind of goal. As someone said today, I think it was Travis, you look over a bunch of them, pick what you like, put them together, write up some new stuff, and it can be a goal to focus your energies and to figure out, okay, we need some on this, that, and then on our issue, which I guess is fracking. So that's good too. And then at some point, your goal is to get that passed, either by referendum or a town board or something, and then you're at another place. So if you look at those as mileposts, I have gotten the impression that there's a tendency to want to move too quickly to getting something written and getting it passed. Because we have to do much better than just getting it passed, whether it's a 4-3 or a 5-2 vote on a board, or whether it's a 52% victory, okay? Because of those people who voted in favor of it, there'll be a few of them that are what I've been calling inoculated. For example, I think I'm pretty much inoculated against frac sand mining. I know enough about aquifers, I know enough about mining of different type that there's virtually no slick corporate commercial which is going to convince me that it's a great thing to just remove all this high-quality sand out there. So I've been inoculated. None of that propaganda is going to work on me. But all of those 52% or 5-2 vote aren't necessarily inoculated that much. So I think we need to get people not just to the level where you can pass it by 52% or a 5-7 vote or whatever I've been saying, 7-5, 5-2. We need to inoculate people so that almost nothing, because if this really gets in the faces of corporations, they're going to be on it, and they're not going to spare any expense. They're going to do the lawsuits against local officials. They're going to do the slick TV campaigns, whatever it is. So I think we need to get an extremely solid understanding of this, way beyond a mere majority, before we even move there, because then the possibilities of backsliding are less, and you have a more solid base. And that's especially true because we're not just having to convince people that frac sand mining isn't good. We're having to convince them that a good part of American constitutional jurisprudence for over a century is fundamentally anti-democratic and anti-local control, and that's harder to understand and harder to convince people of. So I think we need to get further and not concentrate on just barely getting something passed. We need a really solid understanding in the community. So that's something that I thought of several times today, and I thought, I get a chance, I'm going to bring this up. So.
How can we get to that? We're even at this point right now. Just watching and the faces and looking at the people here, I mean, we all came here with our own little issue, which is going to get us up to the big issue of yes, we have to do the community rights, but how can we get to the community rights when we're still stuck down here? We can't even. 3 years you've been educating and fighting, and maybe you had some ideas.
Well, I was just going to say that in writing the ordinance, it just was just even an educational process, even though we'll probably change it before we pass it because we don't have the people behind it. But just deciphering it out and looking at the points helped us clarify things and even understand like what it meant in different situations, and anything from the definitions to things that we thought would matter in that. And so it's
ordinance, you're specifically speaking about a community rights bill or bill of rights. You're not talking about a frac sand ordinance.
Well, it's both. It's a community rights ordinance with a frac sand aspect, for focus to it. So it just gives you something to work on and think about and maybe even take to people later, because we're trying to get good at even talking about what it's about. And so first you kind of got this idea of what community rights is, then how does that figure into the frac sand? And so writing something down helps you start defining it all, because then we're even to the point now like, how do you talk about it with somebody? So it takes, I think, different phases of work in thinking about it to get to those different steps. And so now we're sort of at the point that we want to start widening our circle. But, we're talking about, a lot of times for us it seems like, it's the same 3 people showing up. But sometimes that's not bad, because then you can clarify things with things. If you get too many people in the group, sometimes it's hard to move anywhere with them. But now I think some of our core members are getting it more. There's more to get. It's hard to really understand the whole situation in just a weekend or something. I think we got to be kind of more and more prepared so we can move to the next step.
So at this point, I'm not where you're at. We have our ordinance, our non-metallic ordinance rewritten. And it's passed. I mean, and they took it, and yippee skippy, we're excited because it's a lot better than it was. But now the next step is now I need to get the community rights stuff, and I need to rewrite what we wrote, rewrite what we rewrote, but we need to rewrite it with a community rights focus in it.
Will you clarify what has been passed and by whom for everybody, please?
Our non-metallic mining, oh, okay, I'm sorry. Jackson County, Garfield Township, we rewrote our non-metallic sand mining ordinance. We are not zoned. And we were fortunate, we have a planning commission and a couple of us who aren't on the planning commission who won't go away, like me. And one of them is a lawyer. And he helped us, because we took the town of Howard, the town of Stockholm, the Bridge Creek. I mean, we took everybody's that was out there, and we picked what we liked. Like you guys said, you did the Bill of Rights thing. You looked at all the different Bill of Rights, and you picked what you liked. Well, we did that with all the non-metallic sand mining, and we rewrote that, and we presented it. And I say we, even though I'm not on the planning commission, because I was, like butter on bread, never left him alone. And Garfield Township. And it's on the website under ordinances. But now what I'm starting to understand, the board. It was unanimous. They took it. 3. There's a town guy, the big guy, and then the 2 people that are on there with him. Supervisors, yes. 3-0.
And is this an ordinance that prohibits all this activity, or severely restricts it? Just give us some idea of where we are on that.
It doesn't prohibit, because we were under the impression that if you said, no, you can't sand mine here, then, but we put in very restrictive as far as it gives limits on times, on air, on noise, on that we want. The biggest thing that we said was we want most of the things that they do is that the corporate people say is that, we're never at fault for anything. Well, we have them in our written ordinance is that they have the burden of proof. They have to prove that it's not because of them. And they have to do well testing before anything else and get a baseline. We learned a lot from looking at other people's ordinances.
Just a very strict ordinance regulating non-metallic
Yes.
sand mining.
Yes.
Okay. So, where are you at now? What are you trying to?
So now what I'm thinking is, my understanding is that now we need to look at CELDEF's website. We need to pull up and look at the different Bill of Rights things, pick and choose what we like and see how we can use that, because sand mining was our shoe-in, was our first thing to get our board people on board. And so now if we can start changing some verbiage to reflect.
Let me ask you, to what extent do you feel that this is a township-wide thing?
Yeah.
To what extent do you feel that 50 or 60% of the public would be behind that?
I don't really know, because we tried to get people to come and get involved when we first found out there was going to be sand mining. And when we invited you guys to the church that day, we had quite a but it's like they all came to this informational meeting and then they disappeared, and nobody, again, generational poverty, they all basically put their head in the sand and said, don't bother me. I don't care about it.
It comes down to that working handful, that core group that you got that keeps happening.
Is the ordinance being enforced now? I mean, is it working?
I have a meeting on Monday with the company that is trying to get us to make an agreement with them.
Let me add to something to that too. We did the same thing they did. They passed what we think is one of the more strict ordinances that are out there, and their lawyer happens to be the district attorney for Jackson County that drafted it, and their attorney had no problem with it, and therefore they passed it. We did the same thing. We took stuff from theirs, from Stockholm's, And we took ordinances that we thought were very well authored. For example, Stockholm and Pepin County, Bill Mavity, who was a retired 25-year litigation lawyer and former police officer, and a former judge, Mark Wernick, a former judge from Minnesota, were the two that drafted the Stockholm ordinance. So we figured, can't go wrong, we're looking at those. And then we looked at the one that Ron Koshachek did up in New Auburn, or the town of Howard. And we looked at some top-notch ordinances, Frankfurt, and we looked at them. We did the same thing. We took the best of it. Ours is still on the table, and we're fighting it. We're going up against a very suspect attorney and a very suspect, supposedly independent engineer whose company now works for the mines. So we've got some problems down there. But I guess what I wanted to ask was a point of clarification. I've heard Paul talk about community rights ordinances, and I've heard him talk about community bill of rights. Are we talking one and the same? Are these two different things?
I think this has been developing. I think when it first came out, it tended to be part one addressing a certain local issue that people cared about, and part two stating that at least some of the corporate constitutional protections would not be recognized. So it was a linking of those two things. And it maybe didn't hit all the constitutional protections we can hear, but it hit some of the main ones that they always claim. And it linked those two together so that when the corporations came back and said, nah, you can't do that, go to the regulatory agencies, the locality could say, well, no, we have addressed that in the bill. According to the same bill, you don't have the right to even say that. Now, I think by now, I think of them as kind of three-part ordinances, the jumbo ones. And one of the parts is now some kind of People's Bill of Rights, and that maybe is based on the Bill of Rights. It tends to have maybe some inanimate objects like rivers or animals or ecosystems and other things in it. I mean, just the versions I've seen. So it's a very expansive Bill of Rights. Then there is still a part that addresses your specific claim, in most cases, anti-frac sand mining or whatever it is. And then, thirdly, if it's not implicit in either of the former ones, is a section that makes it very clear that corporations do not have constitutional protections within that jurisdiction. So I think now the latest versions tend to address all three of those. The specific issue, the Bill of Rights, and if it's not yet clear enough, corporate constitutional rights. But I think we have a couple things outstanding. I think there was a question about the enforcement. So I'm going to pass this to you to ask that again, and then someone answer it, and then you. How's that?
Well, my question was specific to you, that you've already passed it, and I think you already answered it. You don't really know yet. You're meeting with the company, right? So we don't know.
What we do know is all the towns that have passed the ordinance that are relatively strict, when somebody passes a really good ordinance, everybody grabs it. And you start seeing it show up in all the ordinances, which is a good thing, because now we're starting to see consistency in the ordinances. And one of the things the mine's complaining about, we have all these different ordinances for every single town. Now if they start looking at them, there's an awful lot of similarities. But the thing that we do know is none of those towns that have written those ordinances have yet to be challenged. And the more towns that come up with those ordinances, the harder it gets to be, because corporations realize that if they take on one town, they're not just taking on the one town. They're taking on a pretty big issue that's going to affect all the towns that have similar ordinances. So it would be a huge issue for a mine to take on. I just heard that Emery Palmer, the mine that's trying to come in down there, the consultant for the mine talked to some of the town people there, and he basically said, after looking at their ordinance, if I make sure I get this right, looking at your ordinance, that he was going to go back to the mine company and tell them that they need to look elsewhere, because there's too many mays and shells in that town's ordinance, and it was way too risky to be challenging it, and that the company did not want to be the first company to challenge. And so maybe that's what's keeping them at bay. It's not to say that somewhere down the line, some big company like U.S. Silica or High Crush or something is going to step in and say, it's enough of this, let's challenge it. It's not to say it's not going to happen, but to date, they've not been challenged.
Which town?
Yeah, Garfield. And Stockholm has one also, and got a lot of, you can find a lot of ordinances online, just Google the town and. Stockholm, Frankfurt, Howard, town of Howard.
Did you say Augusta too?
Bridge Creek, well, we've got one on the table, and we don't know if ours is going to pass or not.
One thing I just wanted you to check on, and for our town of Ettrick, we really look to the zoning. And the state of Wisconsin had everybody, all the townships and that were supposed to be zoning the property. And so, like, we have a mine that wants to come in, and so far the town, our town board just looked to them and said, sorry, it's not zoned for that. And so that was a statewide thing that all the towns were supposed to do. So if your town had done the zoning, it's possible to, well, you didn't do it?
What happened in our town, not with our town board.
Well, it was, for us, that zoning was done years ago. And so there's already a map of the zoning.
That's his comprehensive plans.
Right, so, right, so they, oh, okay.
Our town looked at that and they bailed out. They said we don't want any part of that. So
Well, that's what's saving us.
Yeah, we know that.
Is that your old township, Ettrick?
Yeah.
Zoning, or is it county zoning that you're referring to?
Township, zone area.
And that's in addition to Temple County?
Already done years ago. So when this came up, you just opened the zoning thing and looked and said, sorry, you're not zoned for that.
And you have that in addition to Temple County, because you're part of Temple County zoning too, aren't you?
Right, but the township is different. And generally, if the township has something, the county won't come in and mess with you. Because the township gets to say yes or no. And if the township says no, then the county usually rejects it.
And if the county doesn't reject it, as what happened in Cleveland, they were smart because they're zoned. They rejected a mine company 2 or 3 times. And then they went to the county committee, not the county board. They went to the county committee and say, what do we have to do to get this thing through? And they said, well, obviously your plan is not being accepted. You got to change something. They changed the number of acres. And the committee, lo and behold, the zoning committee approved it. And then it goes to the county. And the county board always follows what the committee does. So the county board approved this mine that the town said no. But because the town was zoned, because they did the proper protocol on following through on it, they had the last say-so when they vetoed the county's vote, and they had the power to do that. That's what zoning can do. And that's what we can't make our town understand. And the only danger to that I see is if you get an issue that comes up where the town board wants this thing to come in and they want to allow a conditional use permit, or the worst thing is to allow an overlay on your zone. Then, or the worst thing is to rezone that area from.
Why don't they want it?
If they rezone it, then you're opening up a new whole can of worms.
They don't, why don't they want zoning? Because they don't want anybody telling them what to do with their land.
That's right.
Don't be telling me what to do with my land.
Yeah, and if we get zoning, that's more stuff and rules and regulations on it. But who knows what they're gonna do to us next?
Yeah.
You know?
The zoning is just to decide, like, who you are.
Yes, they don't understand that if we adopted zoning, we get to write our own comprehensive plan, the town does.
Right.
And that preempts the counties.
So
And our townspeople don't want to have anything to do with
The
it.
thing is that they need to understand is without zoning, they aren't gonna get to say who they are.
That's right.
It's through zoning
But-
that they
But
define them.
here's the problem. The type of town that people, the majority of the people we have in our town, if you mention the word zoning,
They'll shoot you.
they'll shoot you. It's like they don't want to be innocuous. They don't want to have anything to do with it. If you mention the word zoning, you can't tell them anything. They won't hear you. They will not hear you. They'll just say, oh, there's just a bunch, we're known as the environmental radicals. Well, they're the environmental radicals in my book, but we're known as the radicals that try and change all this stuff. And we're saying, we have one guy stand up in the meeting and says, I'm getting rid of all these darn committees. I'm running for chair and getting rid of all these committees. He doesn't know we only have one committee at a time. That's us.
So I don't want to slow down the conversation, but let's try to have the mic follow.
Sorry.
Yeah. I'm done.
Okay.
You speak loud enough.
Yeah.
So in Iowa, we're looking at, in Winneshiek County particularly, we have a Winneshiek County Protectors, and they are a regulation-based, zoning-focused, and they have created a system of overlays. So you can't do any zoning or any extraction within a mile of a residence. You can't do. Winneshiek County Protectors is their title. You can't do any extraction within a mile of a trout stream.
Is this a part of an ordinance?
This is what they've submitted to the County Board of Supervisors for input into the aligning the planning and zoning guidelines with the comprehensive plan that was done a few years ago, because they're not quite in sync. So my question, Jane Ann, is how do we as folks who believe in our ordinance based on community right to clean air, clean water, clean soil, a sustainable energy future, and the various Bill of Rights aspects, help the protectors understand what they're saying is that their ordinance will be plenty good enough as long as the state doesn't decide to pass legislation to preempt what the local county has enforced or set into place. We're trying to say we are a stronger base with which to protect our county, because we're basing not allowing any sand extraction because of our right to clean water, clean air, clean soil, a sustainable energy future, etc. So we're trying to figure out how do we convince these protectors that once industry sees the wealth available, they will simply grease the palms of the legislators to have the preemptive legislation so that we can have a fallback of actually community rights is a stronger.
Yes, thank you. I read that. And how do you say the name of the county? Winneshiek? Winneshiek, okay. I read that. I was very interested in it. One of the things that I do is a lot of research. I can just kind of fall into the black hole of a law library, but there's a lot of good stuff there. And the first thing that I would do here was go to Iowa and look for examples in the books of where the state legislature has done exactly that. You know, look up a couple examples of where the state legislature has gone in and essentially preempted local ordinances, and just have a list of them and say, you know, here they did this. I mean, show them pictures, you know, make a list, put dates on it, and that is fairly impressive, I would think, to get their attention. Or you could go to other states if that will help. And if you talk to these protectors, you might be able to convince them that what they're doing is really important and really clever. Now, the thing about the trout stream, right, within 1 mile of a trout stream, it's kind of a clever regulatory thing that can often get passed and work for a while, that basically never works forever, and so that we should use the time that we have that has given us to move to something which is harder to achieve but could be more solid and permanent if it's there. I mean, I would try that.
So butter them up?
No, basically say they're buying time for a community rights approach. And, you know, there's more than one way that it can work. As you know, it sounds like people have actually had success in keeping certain activities out of their counties or townships for now. That's good. This makes companies think like, well, where's it easiest to, you know, poke this hole? And they're going to go to the easiest place, and that can buy you time. None of those things are permanent solutions, but they can buy you more time. I don't really see anything even minimally permanent unless it's somehow along the lines of the community rights, because the regulatory setting and the state preemption setting is so powerful. So anybody else have some suggestions or observations? Or
Well, our supervisors, we had a CAFO expansion come in the county that was going to be huge, confinement hog feeding. And the supervisors voted 5-0 to send 200 pages of documentation to the state DNR saying why this expansion was not good for the county. The DNR regulatory group voted 7-0 that the county really had no standing in this because of the state pre-exemption on CAFOs.
This happened just last year.
And so the protectors don't even see that. They see that as a fact that state exemption can't override local. But they're saying, well, we know for a year the legislature's not going to pass any statewide legislation on frac sand for a year. But they don't see the need to think about the future and how to actually protect. So we are set aside as the weird contingent because we're trying to do something that's unconstitutional.
Just to add one thing, our goal is to prove that the community rights strategy provides a stronger basis than a regulatory approach. And what the regulatory group in our county says is a stronger basis. You're setting us up to have a major lawsuit. That's the main number one argument that is made against it. And just to give a wider context to in our county, community rights is basically a dirty word.
Where is your county?
Winneshiek County.
Okay, so you're okay.
Yeah, we have to watch out about associating it with people who are running for office, and it's sort of looked down upon as a fringe group, scary type thing. And so yeah, with the number one argument being a stronger basis, you're setting us up for massive lawsuits, and we'll never allow it. I wonder about that.
And as I understand gaveling down the rabble, the powers that be commerce-wise use their right, supposed, I would say privilege, to make money through the Constitution Commerce Clause as legitimate legal defense to override all local zoning through the state preemption and then also the takings. You're taking our right to make money. And so I don't think folks who are hanging their hat, even though it's a good save short term, I don't think folks that are doing regulatory work grab the bigger scenario of once corporate world wants to make money, we're nothing.
Well, I have a little catch up to do. Okay. First, I want to say that at the risk of repeating something that a lot of you know, took civil rights people 58 years to overturn separate but equal, okay, which was passed in Plessy versus Ferguson in 1896. And those were horrible years. It wasn't just discrimination. It was, lynching, huge voter suppression, and so on. We needn't repeat all that. But what the lawyers were running around doing at that time was trying to prove that a certain school, even though it was separate, was not equal. And this meant they had to do things one school at a time, not just one school district at a time. It's a big country, okay, every school. So they had black lawyers trained at great law schools, basically running around in places where they were not allowed to sleep in the hotels there, counting drinking fountains in schools and measuring the temperatures and seeing how many pieces of chalk they had for this black school versus how many pieces of chalk. Ridiculous, long-term, forever, but they were willing to do it because at the time they believed that was the way to get equality for everyone in the United States. Sometime after World War II, things changed really pretty quickly for a number of reasons, but one of them was probably that a number of black Americans who had served in the armed forces came back from places where they'd been treated like human beings and found out that they couldn't eat at the drugstore, they couldn't sit where they wanted on the bus, their kids were in crappy schools, and so on. And sometimes things change quickly, and a lot of things came together again, and it basically forced a lot of the so-called leaders in the civil rights movement to realize that they could no longer prove that something wasn't equal, but they had to actually squarely face a long-standing constitutional doctrine, separate but equal, and say, this whole doctrine has got to go. And it wasn't that many years, and I'm not saying we fixed everything by now, but it wasn't that many years after that the Supreme Court did effectively reverse separate but equal in 1954. So if you build a base of understanding, sometimes things do happen quickly rather than in a short way. But it wouldn't have happened unless you had many people understanding exactly what separate but equal meant. So in this case, I'd say, well, you know, I'll bet I could poke each one of you and you could tell me 10 things horrible that a regulatory agency has done, and yet we continue to cling to that, just like people clung to counting drinking fountains and proving this school was unequal. At some point, I think we have to be ready to face the larger issues, which aren't minor issues. They're absurd. I mean, there's numerous absurd examples in my book, Gaveling Down the Rabble. Which raises the second question, which I've said briefly before, which is, I thought that book was about this constitutional clause and a free trade zone within the United States. By the time I finished writing it, I realized it was really sort of about the Supreme Court. So behind all this community rights issue is a fundamental issue of how our Supreme Court operates, which I can tell you any off-the-shelf reference book in any law library will tell you is the most powerful court in the history of the world. Other countries don't do things like we do it here. In fact, a lot of people in many Western so-called advanced developed democracies just kind of like roll their eyes when the topic of the U.S. Supreme Court comes up, because ours is more powerful, has many different powers vested in it, which most other countries handle differently. Another thing real quick. Some of the most radical analysis I have seen on the United States democracy or judicial system comes not from, anarchist journals. It comes from the top law review journals and law review articles in the nation. I mean, I have been amazed. This is not something I ever expected, but people who are professors at law schools everybody's heard of write devastating articles about all the ways in which our country is not democratic and all the ways in which people's efforts to have democracy sort of work are being frustrated. So, you may feel kind of alone when you're trying to argue with someone who's trying to say at all costs stick with the regulatory agency, but there is a lot of foment out here. And Paul said just this morning, it seems like a week ago, but when he was saying, was it here he said it? About a recent poll about what Americans think about their Supreme Court. There were very few differences between Republicans and Democrats, and there was just a high degree of disapproval for how it operates. So I think a lot of things are happening at once, and they're not all discouraging. And it must have looked really bleak counting drinking fountains, and it must have felt good to shift over into saying separate but equal has to go. And I think that's kind of what we're doing with the rights of local communities to have anything resembling democracy. Did you want to say something? Yeah. You, and then you.
Okay. Yeah, that was really good. Appreciate that. And you mentioned that after the Second World War, things moved quickly, but a lot of times, women's rights and such, that went on for a long, long time. And I think we just have to be ready to devote a lot of time to this. We can't kill ourselves by spending 80 hours a week. But, I mean, we have to be in this for the long haul. That's one point. The other thing, I think we have to find people and groups and political people who are willing, just what you said, to challenge the law. And I'm going to leave it up to Jane Ann. She can decide if this is worth bringing up here. But Thomas Lindsay's work in Pennsylvania, where large numbers of communities, for example, outlawed corporate farming. And as far as I know, hardly any of them ever got challenged. The state just backed down because so many of them did this. So I don't know if you'd like to elaborate on that.
I will say something on that, but we have like two people before me.
I don't know that I can speak to this totally well, but there was just in our meeting with Paul and Lindsay on Friday, they had discussed a new strategy instead of being sued. Maybe you already know this, is that when the lawsuit comes, is to ask the judge to dismiss the suit, saying that the corporations have no basis to sue us because we're writing in our ordinances that they can't come and sue us. So our community rights ordinance says that they have no power to sue us. So we just ask the judge that, saying that they have no standing in our, in our area to do such a thing. And so the hope is then it gets dismissed because of that. So I don't know if you want to.
I will, but let's hear another comment, and then I'll address the several.
Yeah, I'm just asking about something that's more historical, and it was about the there was a Supreme Court case with the railroad, and using the 14th Amendment, and in the header notes, it was written something about corporations being persons, but in the actual decision that the Supreme Court made, that wasn't recognized. And and all this case law is built on top of that. So I just have okay, good.
Okay, first of all, in Pennsylvania, I don't by any means know all the events that happened, but I was at quite a few democracy schools, and I know a lot of the history. It's true that in some areas, the corporations just went to the next township, so it was effective. They weren't challenged and so on. They said, the heck with them, we'll go over here, that'll work fine for us. And I think that worked for a lot of them. In some cases, they were viciously attacked, with all kinds of slap suits against elected officials, funding of alternate people to run there, every kind of, FACO suit you could have coming against the local people. So I think there was a lot of variety, but you're right. It was effective. And at one point, the State Agricultural Association even came down on the counties. So it's a long, complicated story, and I only know some aspects of it, but I think you're right that it worked out differently for different people, and in some cases, they're okay now. They weren't sued and they didn't get the CAFOs. So, but that's a longer story. The other matter that you brought up, yeah, I was going to say that before, but we had a discussion going. Once you get to the point where you have a lot of support and you've agreed on an ordinance with those 2 or 3 aspects that we talked about, and you get that passed comfortably, either as a referendum or by a board, comfortable margin, hopefully a lot of people inoculated. Once you get to that point, you still have options. And one of the options that we've been talking about recently is not to do the logical next step, which is the extraordinarily expensive step, which is where your municipality, whatever it is, has to bear the cost of arguing this, usually in federal courts, against corporations who, if they've made you a test case, are willing to pour gazillions of dollars into it. But in fact, do something which is somewhat parallel to what the I forgot the name, the Chicago 7 did in the 1960s, which is just declare that the forum is not legitimate, essentially, by saying that we have a case in this courtroom where the local residents who want to practice democracy and want to take care of their democracy and protect their community do not have standing to address something with obvious harm that's probably going to come to their community, and declare that for that reason the whole setting is just not legitimate, and it is the corporation who shouldn't have standing, as opposed to the current situation where the residents don't have standing. Now, that also would involve a lot of, I see some frowns, a lot of understanding on the part of the people involved in that, exactly what that means, and the ability to explain that to others who are standing outside and the news media who are going to be pounding on your door and so on. So it involves a lot of understanding, and it would not be a formal legal motion. It would be something done on behalf of, it's just an option, something done on behalf of the people writing a letter to the judge, the people who are, in effect, kept out of the courtroom that is going to decide the fate of the people's community. So yes, I hope that sounded like I gave a very garbled version, but did that make sense to anybody?
Right. Once the CR ordinance is adopted in the locale.
Yes. Let me quickly address this other matter. It's commonly asserted that the Santa Clara case in 1886 is the case that gave corporations the right of personhood. Now, first of all, personhood is not a legal term. I know it's used a lot, but it's really hard when you're trying to do legal research on something. If you start asking the law librarians about personhood, it's not a good way in. It's 14th Amendment, due process, and equal protection rights, which are separate. But yeah, the Santa Clara case is usually claimed because it's the first one that went up to the Supreme Court in 1886, and through a non-official, almost side remark, it was said that yes, and we accept for the purpose of this case that corporations have the 14th Amendment protective rights, due process and equal protection rights. Now, that's not the first time that had appeared. Corporate lawyers had been trying to run that through the federal courts for a long time, practicing, getting their language down, and this was a very clumsy version of it. So some people have said, because it wasn't in the official opinion and so on, that it doesn't really count. And I think that's kind of a red herring, but because, and I have the reference in my gaveling book, twice within the next few years, I believe it's 1888 and 1889 or 1889 and 1890, two other railroad company cases came up to the Supreme Court with very similar issues, and in those cases the Supreme Court said very clearly in the text of the decision, yes, corporations and these railroad corporations do have both due process and equal protection rights. So although the 1886 most often cited case, Santa Clara, was kind of a messy thing, and I know Tom, what's his name? Tom Hartman made a big deal of it in his book, which made great reading. I think it's kind of misleading. There were two further cases in that decade which made it very clear, and the cases in subsequent years all refer back to that.
But wasn't the 86 the precedent that they used in the other two cases?
They discussed it, it's not a good precedent because it really wasn't in the body of the case, and they can refer to it, and yes, everyone knows about Santa Clara now, but I'm saying if there's any doubt about that, the two cases within a few years made it extremely clear that both due process and equal protection. Do you have a hand up? All right. And we're getting back to the last few minutes, so think of things, those of you who haven't said anything so far, or those of you who have something burning to say, you're going to have to do it in the next 5 minutes.
Before we run out of sessions, Jane, I thought you did a good job of discussing how to speak or write your community Bill of Rights on the big corporations versus the corporations of your farmers, the veterinarians, and that's the first question that comes up to me a lot of times is how do you protect the small corporations, family corporations? And I don't think we've addressed that in our Trimble.
Thanks. Yes, thanks for that reminder. This is something that I often bring up, and people sort of look at me cross-eyed, so I was thrilled when Bruce brought it up at lunch today, and I'll say it out there because you are going to get it. You know, there are people going around saying, in corporate personhood, and of course, I agree with them, but first of all, that's a very unclear formulation, and we are dealing with law here, and secondly, it raises a lot of questions that they are not always ready to answer at the time. When I get that, I say, okay, who out there is ready to describe what the world will look like next Tuesday morning if we just pulled the plug on corporate personhood? Who can describe that? And the hands do not fly up into the air. And then I say something like, well, what effect will this have on all these groups like Sierra Club or other nonprofit groups that are incorporated? Okay, have you thought of that? What effect will it have on your neighborhood plumber who is incorporated for liability reasons, and so on and so forth? So I have tried to bring up the fact that there are a bunch of different types of entities, nonprofit, and it's different state to state, nonprofits, charities, different kinds of business corporations in some cases, small business corporations, and if we're going to go around saying remove these rights, we need to be able to describe what effect this is going to have from all the people who raise their hands who have small businesses or are incorporated as nonprofits. And I think not enough attention has been paid to this. It's not an easy question, and it's out there, and when you actually talk to real humans in the community, it's often one of the first ones that come up, and it's important. And so what Bruce and I were talking about briefly is if you're aware of this, and as he said, it's one of the first questions that he gets when he starts talking this up. We/you/all of us together with help and discussion need to figure out a way to have, hopefully not more than a paragraph in there, that clarifies what you do mean, so that it doesn't mean that the neighborhood baker and plumber will no longer have the benefit of some sort of liability protection. Now, it will probably get complicated because right now a lot of things are described as being corporate rights. I don't think the word right should ever be used with a corporation, nonprofit or anything. However, we can get around some of those things by using the word power or the word privilege. Like, it's very convenient for a corporate entity of various kinds to be able to sue or be sued, to be able to sell property, et cetera, et cetera. That's why corporations came about to begin with, largely through educational and church kinds of entities that did need to hold property separate from just a human being. But we're going to have to figure out how to write it up so that corporations of certain kinds, you're probably going to have to define small business or define local business or define nonprofit in perhaps a different way than it's in the current statutes now. Find a way to give those entities whatever power or privileges you think they should have so that they can protect themselves from infinite liability, but without linking that to corporate rights or to the wide range of other constitutional protections that corporations have now. So someone should clarify that or ask me a follow-up. I don't know how that sounded from the outside. Oh. Okay, well, but it's better than not acknowledging it, and it is one of the first questions you're going to get. Hey, I'm a plumber. I'm incorporated. It protects my family, you know?
All my partners, veterinary groups that I've all my life.
Yeah. Yeah, and if you figure it out, you'll share it with all these other groups, and we can all use it. Someone else want to? I saw someone make a move.
One last question. I'm not familiar with law, so when it comes to litigation, let's say a town does the community rights ordinance, they get challenged, they lose. Who's responsible for whose fees? Like, if the town loses, they're responsible for their own fees, I assume, but are they responsible for the challenging attorney's fees also? I don't know how that works.
I think this is where I say I'm not a lawyer. Yeah. And I know it's complicated, and I know in a lot of cases, yes, those fees are awarded. And the first thing we should do is go through the results of what's happened so far. Especially all those cases in Pennsylvania. This is something I wanted to say earlier, which is there are kinds of things that you might like to have in your hand as you're talking to these people. One might be a list of some of the alternative provisions for the ordinance. One might be a little table of what's happened to everyone who's passed one, and so on. So as these things come up, let us know, and it's one of the things that we could set a bunch of people to do research on and produce something that you would find useful as a piece of paper. I don't know exactly how that works. I'm sure it's different in different states, but someone could do a historical thing and put that together.
Some of you were in Augusta about 6 months ago with Paul's workshop, and we had a assigned reading overnight addressing this question of what happens if you're challenged after passing a community rights ordinance. And the article reported that the communities that passed community rights ordinances were less likely to be sued and had a higher success rate than those communities that had passed ordinances banning the activity in a non-community rights framework. So it's, contrary to what I think a lot of people assume when they fear that they're going to be sued. The record is that you're less likely to be sued empirically, according to this article. Paul, it's probably on the website. Yes. I mean, I can, send it to you after this. Yeah.
One of the things I'm not exactly sure of what you're trying to say about the corporations and corporates and the small corporations, but basically, community rights is not against corporations or people of corporations. What we're saying is that we have the right to clean air, water, healthy soil, natural communities, scenic preservation. So if you have somebody who's a veterinarian, unless the veterinarian wants to be dumping gallons of toxic waste in the local stream, there's nothing in our ordinance that's negative to you. If you're an organic farm corporation and you're following the rules that your community sets up for you, with, these types of things about the ecosystem and, welfare of the community, there's nothing in here for you to fear. The only thing that's in here is for people who violate the rights of, which your community sets up in here. And so there's, like I said, there's nothing, if you're the local church nonprofit, I don't know what you would be doing that would be violating this, that you would have any fear at all.
That's a great point, and I have looked at a number of the ordinances, but not all of them, and I don't think all the ones I've looked at have been passed. It's true that many of them I've seen linked the taking away of constitutional protections with specific activities mentioned, like the fracking thing or other kinds of harm to the community. I don't know whether they all do, and that would be something to look through, because if there were some that didn't have that specific link and said fairly generally, hey, in this neck of the woods, corporations don't have these rights, that kind of thing could, in fact, affect a small business. It would take a close reading of all of them for that, I think.
Yes. Nan, you have Mary, sorry. Mary, that's a good point to explain that, but I need to know how to talk into all the discussion that comes up, because the farmers are spreading manure. In our township, there's a whole bunch of legal paperwork that has to be filled out now if you go on public roads. It's an ordinance that I don't know what it is actually. But when you start talking about harming the environment, these people that call in about manure that falls on the road and so forth, the farmers get mixed in with the same thing. That's what...
And that whole issue of the farmers is something, Bruce, that that's one of the things that we need to talk about with Trempealeau County and how we want to, because basically there are farmers in Trempealeau County that are poisoning the groundwater that in, the town of Trempealeau, they've had to dig their well deeper. So, but that's something, I guess, if our local people want to put up with polluting farmers, then we could exempt polluting farmers, or however, we can say whatever we want to say for our community, as everyone else would do for their communities.
In talking to Lindsay some about could we just pass a community rights ordinance that was based on the idea of generating more rights locally and the authority to protect those rights locally. I think his right, and that it was an ordinance that the county had the rights to protect those rights. His comment was if it's not linked to a damage like frac sand extraction, then there's no way to know if it's been violated. And so some laws, he was saying that the legislature needed to act in terms of what does it mean for truth, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. What does that mean? How do you know if someone's pursuit of happiness has been violated? Unless the legislature passed some law that says what that means. Then the courts can look at, oh, that's been violated because of this statute that says you can't do that. So it seemed like it was nebulous to just try and establish. But he was thinking about it.
Oh, I just want to say one word. This is a very personal thing, but we have a big farm near us, and the custom operator was Mennonite. He won't work on Sunday. So they stopped harvesting on Saturday night at midnight, and at 12 midnight, Sunday night, the big trucks start going down the road in front of our house again. We probably do need to look at things like that for the future.
Okay, thank you all. You know, a lot of us will be around for at least a couple hours this evening, some more. Thank you very much for all your comments. I hope you filled out that sheet about what sort of things our group could do, which would be useful and helpful to you, and stay in touch. Thank you very much.
Good job.